uh, Wapastim Tsikhasun, Eastbury Métis Settlement of Genea. So my name is Whitehorse. My colonized name is Jason Big Charles, and I was born and raised on the Eastbury Métis Settlement. And like Joanna said in the brief introduction there, I've been an educator for quite some time now, over the past while focusing on educational leadership and bridging First Nation and Métis cultural teachings with curriculum. So I've been working mainly uh, for this past 2 years with uh, the Northwest Regional Learning Consortia, as well as all the learning consortias throughout Alberta, as well as working for College of Alberta School Superintendents in a cultural advisory capacity, as well as my work with Northern Lakes College in developing this Indigenous Administration micro-credential certificate program. So I keep pretty busy, but my passion, of course, is uh, culture and language of the Cree and Métis peoples, and uh, and the reason why we're coming together right now is, of course, both to recognize a uh, solemn day of remembrance, but also to recognize that day is also a day of celebration, a solemn day of remembrance for those Indigenous children that never made it home from residential school, but also a day of celebration for the survivors of residential school. So I'm going to take you into the Indigenous Administration micro-credential course, and you'll get a look at what the uh, participants of that course get to work through. But specifically, we'll be looking at one section today, and that's section 4 of that micro-credential. So I'm going to share my screen right now and just give you a quick run through of that micro-credential that is part of the Indigenous Administration Certificate Program. So here we have the welcome screen to micro-credential number 6, which is ceremonies and protocols. And in this micro-credential, it walks through module 1, looks at elder protocols and cultural protocols. Then it goes into module number 2, which is powwows and celebrations. So history of the powwow, regalias, drumming and singing, attending powwows. And module 3 looks at ceremonies and gratitude. So the various introductions to the pipe ceremony, sweat lodge ceremony, sundance ceremony, full moon ceremony, ghost dance or tea dance ceremony, as well as sacred fire ceremony. And today, what we're focusing on is module number 4 of that micro credential number 6, which is, of course, truth and reconciliation. Now, over the past couple days, I've talked with groups about sections 1, 2, and 3, which was Truth and Reconciliation, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the calls to action. But today, of particular interest, we're going to be looking at September 30th, which is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, as well as what we've come to know as Orange Shirt Day. So I'm just going to show you this short video on what the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation uh, is embodying. So when they talk about truth and reconciliation and the freeing of the spirit, you heard the elders speaking there. There were We got to remember that during the residential school, the imposed residential school on Indigenous children, there were over 150,000 recorded children that were sent forcefully to residential school. And of those, only about half returned home following residential school. And we're going to be looking next at Orange Shirt Day and what Orange Shirt Day sort of embodies and the origins of Orange Shirt Day. And when we watch this, the story of Phyllis Webstad, I really want you to sort of keep in mind that Phyllis Webstad's story is just one story, one of those 150,000 children's stories, and it's a story that we as Indigenous people hear every day from our parents, our aunts, our uncles, our grandparents, and every single one of them has a similar story. So keep in mind that this is just one tiny raindrop out of a storm of different stories. But I want you to get a chance to hear Phyllis Webstad's story and hear the origins of Orange Shirt Day and why we call it Orange Shirt Day.
I am Shawetmach from the Strachamach, Kenno Creek, Chatstam, Dog Creek First Nation, which is about 1.5 hours southwest from Williams Lake, BC. I grew up with my granny on the Dog Creek Reserve until I was 10, then moved with my auntie after she finished university. When I had just turned 6, I was sent to the St. Joseph Indian Residential School near Williams Lake, a place we called the Mission. My granny bought me a shiny new orange shirt to go to school in. When I got there, I was stripped, my clothing taken away, including my new orange shirt, and I never saw it again. I was no longer excited to be going to school. I wanted to go home to Granny. I had to stay there for 300 sleeps. No matter how much all of us little kids cried, it didn't matter. No one listened to us. Our feelings didn't matter. We didn't matter. I am the third generation that attended residential school. Both my grandmother and mother attended the mission for 10 years each. Today is a day to honor and remember residential school survivors and their families. Every child matters, even if you're an adult. We must also remember those children that never made it and are no longer with us. Today is a day for survivors to tell their stories and for us to listen with open hearts. I am humbled and honored that you are all taking part in Orange Shirt Day. When I was in school, I didn't know my own history, so I am overjoyed that you are taking part and learning the true history of Canada's First Peoples. Gukshjem, thank you.
Listening to Phyllis Webstad's story, like I said, it's one small story out of a whole rainstorm of stories that we hear as Indigenous people from our relatives and our friends, and we share these stories. And on the first video we watched with Chief Billy Morin and the elder talking, you hear the song playing in the background, and that song is a Cree song, a Cree honor song. And what that song really speaks to is this is a song that was passed down uh, far preceding first contact. And that song that they were singing with the drum was basically the words were saying, as Cree people, we teach our people, we have the teachings that we love children, all children, and that we're told and taught to love all children as though they're they're our children. And that's how we were brought up as Indigenous people, with that essence behind that. So you can imagine the trauma that families were going through, that especially the children were going through, and the mothers and fathers having their children being taken from them. And like Phyllis Webstad's story, having their identity stripped from them, their language, their culture. And for Phyllis, the biggest thing she always still clung into, that was burnt into her memory for her entire life, was how proud she was to get this new orange shirt. And her first day of residential school, that was stripped away from her. And it just shows that that physical representation of being, not only the culture and language being stripped, but the pride, because of the pride she had in that shirt and it being stripped away from her, and losing that losing that pride along with everything else, culture, the language, the family. So just as we saw in the videos there, where September 30th is to be remembering and celebrating the survivors, because they very much so did survive traumatic experience. But it's to remember all those that never returned home as well, and remembering that every child matters, uh, whether they didn't make it home, uh, or they did make it home. Every one of them mattered, and they still matter even today. So, as Indigenous people, we've really been talking, especially this past week. I've been sitting with a lot of different educators, knowledge keepers, elders, and what we're seeing now is a real move toward truth. When we talk about truth and reconciliation, because we never did really move past truth, because the truths keep coming out every day, and 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 that acknowledgement of past wrongs is still in the process of happening. So I think before we can move forward with reconciliation, we still have to get past that truth and acknowledgement. And nothing could embody that more than just a week ago, uh, when the Canadian College of Surgeons, or Canadian Medical Association, uh, just last week finally acknowledged and gave an apology for their part in what happened in residential schools with the forced sterilizations and the experimental drugs being used on residential school children, Indigenous children. For myself, that apology from the Canadian Medical Association was kind of twofold. On one side, I was kind of relieved that they finally acknowledged that yes, there was wrong, that the wrongs that were done, and they do have records of the wrongs that were done, and the apology. So there was relief on that side, but on the other side, there was a great deal of sadness, having my own personal experience with, especially from that medical side, what happened to some of my family members. With my dad's with my dad's family, him and his siblings, they were both sent to residential school, and they were him and his siblings were both all put through some of they experienced some of that medical experimentation, because they were forcefully given an experimental polio vaccine at the time. And this was only being done to Indigenous children who were enrolled in residential schools. And even though their parents, my grandparents, were notified, they were just notified. They weren't asked uh, permission. They weren't asked if they could do this with their children. In fact, they were told if they uh, if they had any problem with it, they would be sent to jail for disagreeing with it. So anyway, they went through the experimental polio vaccine, and out of my dad's siblings, I have an aunt and an uncle who both, as a result of those experimental vaccines, they both developed polio, something that affected them their entire life. Now, unfortunately, I lost my uncle about 5 years ago from the results of the polio. My aunt is still alive with the definitely the effects of polio. She can't walk. She can't lift her head. She can't lift her arms, and this is all because of that experimental drug that was used on them in residential school. So uh, we hear stories about it, but it's if you really talk to those who are suffering and working through generational trauma, like myself, I didn't go to residential school, but I definitely uh, clearly and openly identify that I do suffer from generational trauma in a great many different ways. But we talk about that generational trauma and how it still affects us today. And another thing that's come out of, especially recently, we're seeing a growing surge in denialists who are non-Indigenous people who are coming forward and coming with very hurtful and very uh, ignorant responses like, uh, this happened way in the past. Why are we bothering to talk about it? Like, this is ancient history. Uh, this that it never really happened. It's just a story that's being made up for indigenous people are just trying to get money from it. Like, very hurtful and unbelievable uh, denialist claims like that. There are no bodies that were found. There's no proof of it. Unbelievable, and it's unbelievable how hurtful it is for Indigenous people, especially Indigenous uh, survivors of residential school and the children of residential school survivors, because we've had to live with the stories of our parents and our aunts and our uncles through our whole lives and listening to them talk about what they experienced. I know with my both my parents, my mom also was sent to residential school. She attended the Gruard mission. She was sent to. Now, with her, for her side, she, in her mind, she says her experiences weren't as bad, and that's only because she says she wasn't sexually abused, and although she was physically abused, she said it was uh, something that they sort of grew to accept. So in her mind, she didn't have that bad of an experience. However, for myself, uh, listening to some of her stories, like, I was just blown away, thinking, how could you think that this is that this wasn't a horrible experience? When she talks about being fed rotten vegetables and being forced to eat them and being told that if they didn't eat them, they'd have nothing else to eat, or being forced to wear the the flour sack or potato sack dresses and and stuff like that. Uh, where she on from her side, she said it's not that bad, but for myself, I was just so hurt and so angry. I was angry for her, even though she was more accepting of what she went through. So it's as Indigenous people, it's I guess it fuels and it adds to the trauma that we go through, especially generational trauma, as we're faced with denialists coming forward and claiming that or we're just doing this for money, or we're just doing it to get attention for ourselves. Well, no, I'm sorry. We are struggling daily, uh, emotionally and often physically, like my aunt, and trying to work through that. So it's a definitely a hard road and a still a long, hard road. Because, like I said, I think we're still at the point of truth and acknowledgement, and then we can move forward to reconciliation. And what reconciliation might look like? Well, I think we're definitely uh, putting that into practice right now, where we're really building on understanding and really getting that understanding out there. So one of the so when we look at the Orange Shirt Day, for anybody wanting to learn or look at more things that are going on throughout Alberta, or even throughout our northern region here in northern Alberta, there is somewhere where I'd strongly suggest you go to if you want to hear stories of residential school survivors. Uh, there's a lot of elder stories on there, as well as resources for for not only children in school, but for adults to work through um, resources and readings and videos to watch. And that is on the Empowering the Spirit website. I'll just put that up. I found it a really good resource, especially with my work with the province. We really refer to that website a lot because of the richness of the resources in there. So it's called Empowering the Spirit, Educational Resources to Support Reconciliation. You could see uh, the web address in the address bar. So it's just empoweringthespirit.ca. But it's has a lot of excellent resources. So professional learning for adults, so key concept and legacy of residential school. And it's got a whole plethora of different videos on all different subject matter, as well as elder testimonials. And just an excellent website for anyone wanting to either learn more about Orange Shirt Day or look at some of the initiatives that are going on throughout the province for Orange Shirt Day. But it's just an amazing resource for anyone wanting to really look at what we can do to help, because there are current initiatives out there in presentations and uh, events that are going on for Orange Shirt Day. So again, that's just empowering the spirit. So one of the big parts of the whole reconciliation process, of course, is most definitely acknowledging the land and land acknowledgments. So I'll go back to the Indigenous micro credential number 6, and we'll look at the territorial acknowledgments that are in there. I'll just share my screen again. So section 5 of the Indigenous Administration Microcredential 6 is territorial acknowledgments. And we'll see here that it gives just sort of an intro on territorial acknowledgments and sort of the reasoning behind territorial acknowledgments. But before we're going to take a quick look at this brief video on territorial acknowledgments. But before we do that, I just wanted to mention that as Indigenous people, uh, predating first contact. We ourselves had territorial acknowledgments amongst each other. And a lot of those who still practice traditional ways, like myself, if I'm going into another nation's territory, I acknowledge that and ask permission to come into that territory. So, say if I were going to uh, Enoch Cree Nation near Edmonton, I would approach one of the elders or leadership and request permission to enter their territory. And then I would acknowledge that I am entering their territory and I, I recognize that it's their traditional lands. So we had our own traditional territorial acknowledgements amongst our different nations. And like I said, that still exists today amongst our elders and traditionalists. But we're just going to quickly watch this short video on territorial acknowledgements and going beyond. And I'm just going to stop sharing for a second because I think I forgot to include sound again. There we go.
The University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that we are situated on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people.
Excuse me, should we go?
Excuse me?
Oh, no, I just mean if we're on someone else's land, shouldn't we leave?
Territorial acknowledgements have become an important, everyday act towards recognizing Indigenous peoples' histories and contemporary realities. But have they become so commonplace that we've forgotten what they stand for?
I'm so sorry, I'm so confused. So whose land are we on? What are we doing?
It's a dialogue.
How are we making right?
Well, there's a plaque you can read in the lobby.
In this video, we'll hear from faculty and staff about the importance of acknowledging territory and how to create an acknowledgement that is personal, authentic, and continually committed to reconciliation. So why is it important to acknowledge territory? Before European settlers came to Miskwaciwâskahigun, there were many Indigenous nations living and thriving in these lands. Amiskwaci means Beaver Hills in Nehiyawin, or Cree. The name for Edmonton, Amiskwaciwâskahigun, means Beaver Hills House. Kissaskatchewan CP is a Nehiyawin, or Cree word for the North Saskatchewan River. It means swift, flowing river.
Our institution and other higher education institutions are contested spaces, especially for Indigenous peoples, due to a long history of educational policies that were not friendly towards Indigenous peoples, their points of view, their cultures and languages.
It is important for me to acknowledge the land, and so I am able to continue to develop my knowledge of Indigenous peoples' histories, educational experiences, and knowledge systems, their ways of knowing and being.
Some worry that the territorial acknowledgement is just words at the beginning of a semester. But as a literature professor, I have a lot of faith in words and what they do.
Creating your own territorial acknowledgement. Tip 1. Make it relevant. Tie your acknowledgement to the reason you are gathered. Bring it out of abstraction and make it concrete.
Whenever possible, I like to take students outside to acknowledge territory. I think that when we're inside a classroom, it's very easy to forget where we are. And outside, you can really think about what it means to be here.
We also wanted to recognize that copyright, which is the topic of our presentation and our instructional videos, is a Western concept, and it is hugely incompatible with Indigenous knowledges and cultural expressions. So we wanted to recognize that and share our hope that by contributing to copyright education, we can help reveal some of those issues in the future.
Tip 2. Research and engage with the histories and Indigenous peoples of the places you live and visit.
Knowing what words mean when you include that in your land acknowledgement, whether that be an elder or knowledge keeper, someone who may have taught it, someone who is living it. So perhaps an Indigenous person or a Métis or an Inuit person who can say to them, here's why including the word Inuit is important to me. Here's why including the word Métis is important. What do these words mean?
Tip 3. Ask yourself, what does it mean to live, work, and play on Treaty 6 territory?
We are supported by Indigenous educators, faculty members, and elders. It is important for me to acknowledge this as I am continually learning and working on the land, the Treaty 6 in which I inhabit.
Acknowledging treaty and Indigenous territory is important to me, and I think it is also for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. For me, as a descendant of settlers, I'm here because of treaty.
We are all treaty people. We all have responsibilities in relationship to the people and the land. What are yours? Tip 4. Ask yourself, what does it mean to live, work, and play on the Métis homelands? Alberta is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta and 8 Métis settlements. These Alberta Métis settlements are the only government-recognized Métis land base in Canada.
So sorry for cutting that short, but I did that for a very specific reason. And that video is actually about a year and a half old. And since then, a great deal has happened in a shift in territorial acknowledgements throughout Alberta, and I think throughout the nations as well, with elders and knowledge keepers. But before I move on to that, I wanted to share an interesting thing. You remember at the beginning of this short video where they talked about Amsquitsi Waskayagan, which of course is Beaver Hills House, or the traditional name for Edmonton. And I'll just give you a neat uh, little tidbit from a traditional knowledge base side of history. So, according to our oral history, uh, the actual reason why that area where Edmonton is now was called Amsquitsi Waskayagan, was, well, Beaver Hills House, was because in our traditional legends and our traditional stories, we have still stories passed down from generation to generation that actually tell stories about these giant beavers, these huge beavers that um, lived and were still around uh, generations back within the Cree peoples. And they tell stories about these giant beavers and the houses they'd built, because the houses were perfectly round, and they were a perfectly round mound. So that's what they would actually call the Beaver Hill, or Umsquitsi. And and of course it was Umsquitsi Waskagan. It was a Beaver Hill house. That's where these giant beavers lived. Something I found amazing is here in my territory here, I'm on the Eastbury Métis settlement, uh, not too far, maybe an hour drive from Cadotte Lake, uh, the Cadotte Lake Nation, or Woodland Cree Nation. But I had an elder take me out to look at one of these um, Squitsy, these beaver hills, and I was amazed because it was this huge hill going up maybe 40 feet, and it was in the middle of a flat area. So it was a place where no hill had any business being, but it was perfectly round, and it was Squitsy. It was it was a beaver hill. And then he told a story about how the giant beavers lived there. So really neat how oral history uh, gives a different take on names and places, and why we have those names. But anyway, in terms of territorial acknowledgements, the big shift amongst First Nations and Métis peoples in our region, and a lot of the elders and educators I work with, knowledge keepers, is that territorial acknowledgements need to evolve because when we're recognizing uh, stuff, names like Treaty 8 territory, that is really a colonized name for our territories. So the elders are saying, no, we don't want to be called and recognized for our colonized labels that we've been given, which is the treaty territories. They rather want to be acknowledged by their nation, their individual nation. So I am coming to you from the East Prairie Métis settlement. So if I were non-Indigenous and I were acknowledging the territory, I would acknowledge that I am on the traditional lands of the East Prairie Métis people. And I would acknowledge that this is their territory. Um, if I were presenting and if I were non-Indigenous in High Prairie, or or let's say High Prairie or Slave Lake, I would acknowledge by name the nations that are nearby whose territory I'm on. So if I were in High Prairie, I would acknowledge that I'm on the Capowino Nation's territory, the Sucker Creek First Nations territory, Driftpile Cree First Nation territory, East Prairie Métis traditional territory, but I would name the nations by name rather than calling them the Métis settlements or calling them Treaty 8 territory. Because again, we've just reclaimed our identities as Indigenous peoples, and we are wanting to proudly be called by our nation identities rather than those colonized labels. So this is what our elders and knowledge keepers are really urging. And the other thing they talked about in in discussing that was that it it builds meaning to us as Indigenous people because it tells us that if somebody is coming into our territory and acknowledging it, then they have taken the time to look at which communities or which nations are nearby or uh, which nations the territory is traditional territory for. So it's taking it a step further and really uh, making us look inside ourselves and looking at really where we are. They mentioned that in the video where they said that they go outside and they like to really acknowledge that we're on somebody's traditional hunting and gathering lands, like myself. With if somebody comes and recognizes that this is my territory where I hunt and gather today, that would really mean something to me that they're acknowledging that I still actively hunt and gather on this land, on this territory. And for somebody to acknowledge uh, that sense of belonging, and it really means a lot as an Indigenous person. So it's taking that a step further and really looking at which nation am I on, which nation's traditional lands. Uh, and again, it's it's not it's not even asking permission. It's just acknowledging that that land belongs to that. Uh, maybe not in title, maybe not in writing, but traditionally, that land does belong to that nation and those peoples who still to this day hunt and gather on these lands. Uh, I hope you've taken something from the material we've presented and at least giving you something to think about. So I guess we're almost at our allotted time limit here, but before we part ways again, as a Cree Métis person, again, I very much have to express Kinanaskum Tinawao Kahkiao, and I'll just explain what that means in my grandmother's tongue. Kinanaskum Tin. Nowadays, when we try to translate Cree to English, we really lose a lot of the meaning because Cree is very uh, it's a language that's full of verbs and actions, and it's very conceptual. So the language really speaks in concepts rather than just simple words. So Kinanaskumtin right now is used a lot, translated as thank you. However, really looking at the word Kinanaskumtin, uh, it means much, much more because when I say Kinanaskumtin which is uh, uh, more plural. Kinanaskum is plural, meaning many people, and kahkiao just means all, so all of you. So when I say kinanaskum tinawao kahkiao, kinanaskum tin is translated as I am, my spirit is lifted by the exchange that we've just had. My heart and my soul is lifted by this, and and that's where I'm saying it's hard to translate English into English properly because we lose so much of the essence of the language. And I'm sure all the other languages are the same, Blackfeet and Ojibwe and Dene. I have I'm pretty sure that it's the same with them as well. We lose that essence of the language and the true meaning. So when I say "Kinanaskwam Tinawaw Kakkiaw," I am saying my heart, my spirit is lifted by you all uh, for the exchange we just had. So I'm again very thankful to each one of you for opening your heart and your mind and joining me this evening and taking this journey together toward reconciliation. So with that, kinanaskom tinawakakyo, samaga.